Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible. I'm William Bell, and with me is Don Preston. How are you doing, Don? Let's see. I lose him. Don, are you able to hear me?
Sorry about that. Yes, I can hear you. I was saying I'm sorry to hear that you're kind of under the weather. I understand you got some allergies going on or something like that. But hope you get to feeling better real soon.
Yeah, well, I'm beginning to feel better. Now it's just the congestion, in the head and sinuses, and just dealing with that part of it. The headache and scratchy throat and everything is pretty much gone. So hopefully I'll be doing better. I think one of the problems
it's that time of the year.
Yeah, it is. And I know that, all these custom temperature changes definitely have an effect on me from time to time, and especially around this time of year, and sometimes during the winter. So as long as it stays, constant, but when you are changing temperature like every other day, then that really gets to you.
Yes.
At least to me. So I don't know how it affects other people, but sometimes it affects me that way. And then, of course, I've been traveling, which has actually been a lot of stress that you probably didn't realize you were under. But when you come home and try to get back settled and jump back into everything, you realize that, hey, you've been busy, moving, doing a whole lot of things all through this time. And then, with the debate with Holger, while I know he was probably under the most stress, it was still an event that, we all fully participated in one way or the other. And so that could have something to do with it, but I'm not sure. At any rate, I just hope that it's over with soon. Excuse me. So how things your way? Everybody doing as well as can be expected?
Yeah, everybody's doing as well as can be expected, and we're enjoying some good weather. We just about got blown away over the weekend. I'm telling you, we had winds. Well, we had winds here in the Ardmore area of over 65 miles an hour, and there were limbs everywhere. And so it was kind of a wild weekend. We did kind of dodge the bullet, so to speak, because they had originally said that we were going to get between 6 to 7 inches of rain in one day. And we just barely got a sprinkle that day, so we were actually quite lucky. But that front that they said was going to produce all of that rain went all the way up through the northwest Arkansas region where my family lives. My sister, who lives at Fayetteville, actually Greenland, which is immediately south of there, she has a little small creek that runs in front of her house, and it has seldom ever gotten out of its banks. But she sent pictures of it yesterday, and I mean, it was literally a raging torrent. There would be no way whatsoever for her to even attempt to get out of her drive, because she would have to cross that. There's a little small bridge across it, but that bridge was completely under. Like I said, just an absolute raging torrent. So it was some really, really nasty weather.
Well, fortunately, everybody came out of it safely, I hope. And I know that there was some people who had some real serious problems in some of that flooding. And one family had some children that had to be rescued. But we're grateful that, they were able to do that, and I think the last report I heard, they were doing fine. So, your family's doing fine with all of that going on.
Yeah.
That's very good, and we're grateful to God for that.
It's scary, scary stuff. Listen, William, last Tuesday you began giving us a report on the debate between Howard Denham and Holger Neubauer. And I know that I've read a few excerpts on the internet, on YouTube, and what have you, but you were there. You attended the debate. You personally heard the exchanges. And I know in your conversations with me privately, you said that Holger had done just an outstanding job. And so you were beginning to give us a review of some of the exchange, some of the arguments that were made. And you didn't even get very far in your review of that. So I think it would be good if we continued that this week. I know I was talking to Steve Baisden today on the phone, and he told me that Holger had done tremendously much better in this debate even than he had done in the first debate. And I had watched an awful lot of the first debate, pardon me, and thought that there were many times in which he just did an outstanding job. So I'd like for you to continue that review. Tell us a little bit, again, about some of the arguments, some of the points that you think Howard Denham felt like he had made a great argument, and how Holger Denham answered those, and conversely, some of the powerful arguments that you believe that Holger Neubauer made.
All right. Well, I'll do my best to remember as much of it as I can for this particular hour, and if we have to revisit it, sometime intermittently, we can do that. But it was a great debate to attend, and it was very interesting to watch Holger and to watch Denham, who, as we were saying last week, started out with some very denigrating remarks about two people that you and I know very well. I thought that was way out of place for the debate, but as you know, we've experienced that before, and it will continue to happen. Sometimes I think that one of the reasons they try to poison that well is to prevent us from having the opportunity to even teach more people, and I'm sure that's kind of what's behind it. But back to some of the arguments that were made. Denham argued that Holger had made reference to the holy people in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 7 when he was speaking on the power of the holy people being shattered. So Denham ridiculed that. He said, can you believe that he is claiming that these Jews who were considered as thieves, as rapists, as cannibals, as murderers, etc., would be regarded as the holy people? And of course, he cited Josephus and his description of them during the siege of Jerusalem during that time for his verification in terms of the descriptions that he gave. So Holger responded with Romans chapter 11 and stated that the Bible said concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And so he demonstrated very clearly that God referred to them as his elect, even though many of them were, had fallen away or were refusing to accept the Messiah and responded to Denham, and Denham never brought it back up again after.
I would think not.
After he made that response. And another point that we were making last week was that he said Daniel 12 was the time of the Maccabees, and that it was the time of the Seleucids and that persecution. So he was trying to refute the idea that Daniel 12 refers to the resurrection. And Holger's argument had been that Daniel 12 was the only place that mentioned the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And so Denham's approach was that he was going to walk through a little bit of Daniel to show that it was referring to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So in Holger's response, he pointed out several things. One of them was that, he pointed out that the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel was spoken of also by Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 24. And he pointed out that you could not separate those two, that what Denham was doing was appealing to some of his scholarly references, which Holger said he was being inconsistent on that, in that he would accept the scholars who were dead, that is, if they were dead, Denham would approve of them, but if they were living, he would not approve of them and would castigate them as not being, members of the body of Christ, etc., members of denominations, etc., and so he would not accept them. And so Holger pointed out his inconsistency on that, but he also, drove the point home that the time of the abomination of desolation was that which was stated by Christ. And he asked Denham if he was going to get up and deny that Jesus had said that. And another very important point that he made was that Daniel was going to rest at the end of the days. So he asked Denham if Daniel was going to rest at the end of the Seleucid persecution. And I tell you, that was a very telling point as far as Holger's position was concerned. It was very, very telling point. And Denham really didn't touch that. He made a few passing remarks, but he never really got into dealing straightforward with that particular argument that Holger made on that point. And the other point that Holger made from Daniel 12, as I said, he coupled Daniel 12:2 with Acts 24:15, which has come up many times in discussions where people are denying Daniel 12, and he's showing that this was the only text, as I said earlier, that mentioned the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and that was Acts 24:15. Now they did have some discussions on the word mellow just a bit, but Denham never produced anything that negated the use of the infinitive. He tried to use Young's literal translation against Holger, and he cited some other translations that just gave a very broad view. I think it was one, I can't remember the reference, but there was one reference that he used that gave a very broad definition of mellow that was not necessarily focused on the use of mellow with the present infinitive. And so that obviously did not meet the demands of the argument, number one. But he showed that Paul was citing Daniel 12:2 in that particular text. And, of course, Denham had no answer for that one as well. And, again, Holger made some very powerful points. Some believe that Holger's second speech in the debate was the most powerful one. Now, if you were sitting there, we'd only heard one speech at that time. We just heard his first speech and we heard his second speech. And certainly his second speech seemed, very powerful. But when you go back and listen to the entire debate, you'll see that he did a fairly consistent job all the way through. At least that was my impression. having been there and then having gone back and watched it, that he was pretty solid all the way through. Now, his arguments in the second speech might have been, a little bit more clear and precise, but at the same time, they were very, very powerful. Now, Denham, argued that the spiritual resurrection had already taken place, and he cited 1 Corinthians. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was just laughing.
Oh. He cited that the spiritual resurrection had already taken place. And as you know, that's a position that, many have taken. And they cite, passages like Ephesians 2, and of course, Denham cited 1 Corinthians 6, 19, and 20 as one of those passages that would emphasize the resurrection of the body, since he said that the spiritual resurrection had already occurred. And so he was citing this particular text to demonstrate that. And Holger came back and responded that Romans 5 talked about the death that passed upon all men through sin, and he paralleled that with both Romans and 1 Corinthians 15, and pretty much asked Denham how he was going to respond to that. And of course, again, we basically hear silence, and that was the one overriding point in Denham's affirmative, is that he affirmed very little. And why is that not unusual, right?
No,
but he affirmed very little in terms of his proposition. Now, he did make several arguments, but in terms of trying to establish the resurrection of the body, which was the actual premise that he had, he did not. Now, he charged Holger with Gnosticism, actually a reverse Gnosticism, and made some other charges against him. He argued that the mortal body, as I said before, that the mortal body equaled the body that was subject to physical death, because he said mortal means, subject to die, or means, a body that was subject to death, and so that was his argument on the mortal body. But in that process, he was contradicting something that he was saying. So Denham was actually arguing for two different points from Romans chapter 8. One point, as I mentioned last week, he was arguing for the body in Romans 8 and verse 10 as the ministration of death in terms of Judaism. He said that was the ministration of death, and he was referring to the Old Covenant. And then he turns around and argues that the resurrection in that text is a resurrection of the body. So Holger's response, from Romans 8 was of course, he tied in Romans 5 with that for sure, but he also tied in Romans 8:15 and the adoption, pointing out that the adoption was a reference to the sons of God coming into the body of Christ and coming out of the old covenant body. Denham never had an answer for that. He never had a response for that, and didn't really even attempt to deal with that particular argument. And as you know, we talked a little bit last week about Genesis 1 through 11, where he made the charge that you didn't even believe that, and of course, that was a false charge that was made, and he makes the other charge that he charged Holger with universalism, because he said if spiritual death ended in 70 AD, then no one has died since 70 AD. And of course, people make that argument all the time, and it sounds really good on the surface of it. But I do, just like you just did a moment ago, when you hear it, you kind of just chuckle a little bit. And because what he's trying to do is charge us with universalism by saying if we believe that the resurrection occurred in 70 AD. That was the end of death. Well, if you really look at it, they have sin put away at the cross. As a matter of fact, and I don't know if I covered this last week, but I thought I began to mention it. Denham made an argument in one of his speeches that when Jesus said, "It is finished," he had a quote, or in defining the word that was used there, and he was very forceful and very emphatic with it in saying that this meant completely finished, paid in full, in essence, nothing else left to be done. Well, now, this is when Jesus said it was finished. This was before he had even died, and that the price was paid in full. Well, of course, Holger refuted that quite handily in pointing out that Jesus hadn't even been raised from the dead. But I want to go back to another argument that he made on, this one on Matthew 10 and verse 23. Denham argued from Matthew 10 and 23 that was a reference to Pentecost. And,
what?
Yes. Absolutely. And Holger's response was about like yours in terms of, he said that this is an argument from desperation. And what's happening is, as you know, when these guys are facing these arguments in debate, some of them they haven't seen before, some of them they've never had to deal with before. So he argued that it was Pentecost. And Holger pointed out that it had nothing to do, that it really wasn't Pentecost. And he went to the text to point out the fact that this was the time that the Gentiles had come in, and that the Gentiles didn't come in until later, and that they were going to be taken up, before these councils. They would have preached to the Gentiles, etc., because he pointed out the time of Cornelius, and when the Gentiles came in, he pointed out when they would be taken up before the Gentiles, etc. So he just asked Denham, he said, when were they taken up for the Gentiles, like before Acts 2? And again, those were the kind of questions that Holger was putting to him and that he had no answer for. So he turned the charge of universalism back on him. He pointed out very clearly that in Matthew 10 and verse 23, that was a reference to the apostles fleeing the cities of Israel for refuge from the persecution, as opposed to some event happening prior to then. And again,
in other words, Denham, by saying that Matthew 10:23, where Jesus said, for our audience sake here, you would not have gone through the cities of Jerusalem or of Israel until the Son of Man has come. So Matthew 10:23 applies to the quote coming of the Lord on the day of Pentecost. But if I understand you correctly, and I'm sure that's what Holger did, Matthew 10 refers to the apostles preaching the gospel, being persecuted for preaching the gospel, and fleeing throughout all of the cities of Jerusalem, and will not have fled through all of those cities before the Son of Man had come. And so Holger was pointing out, correctly so, that the apostles had not been preaching the gospel of Christ prior to Pentecost. They had not been persecuted for preaching the gospel of Christ before Pentecost. Therefore, Pentecost could not be the coming of the Son of Man. Is that correct? Is that what Holger argued?
Yes, that is definitely correct.
I would say that would be a pretty effective refutation of Howard Denham.
Oh, yeah. And, if you to add to that, just on that text, the text says they would be taken up before the councils, and they were not to even take thought of what they would speak, because the Holy Spirit would speak in them, that the words would be the words of the Holy Spirit. So there again, you have a post-Pentecost action or activity that's taking place in that context, whereas they would be forcing the Holy Spirit to have come prior to that time with this, with the interpretation that Denham placed on the text. a big part of their argumentation centered around Acts 1:11. Now, that's one argument that Denham continued to bring up over and over again because he thought, that it was one of his strong points. And his argument, basically was they were going to see Jesus come in the same manner as he went. He emphasized, as you see him go. And so he pointed that out. Now, what's interesting is that, Denham parallels Revelation 1:7 with Acts 1:11, if memory serves me correctly. So Holger responded to that by pointing out that what the apostles saw was Jesus shrouded in a cloud, which was the manifestation of his presence or God's presence in the Old Testament. It was always shrouded in a cloud, that is, unseen from that perspective. And so he said, as Jesus ascended, he was shrouded in the cloud, and so they did not see him. He was hidden in the cloud. He was there. It was the same Jesus, but they did not see him because the cloud received him out of their sight. And he said he was going to come in the same way because this was going to be a manifestation of, or a revelation of, Jesus Christ. And he pointed out that's what the book of Revelation was all about. And he says it is the revelation, not many revelations. And so Christ was being revealed in the clouds. And he also stated that he went to Luke chapter 21, and he pointed out that Luke 21, verse 27, that also spoke of Christ coming in the clouds, was used by For Wallace Jr., for those who are familiar with him, as a parallel text to Revelation 1:7. Holger pointed out that he said those were the same passages. And so, along with his argument on receive them out of their sight, and that these were parallels, and then he pointed out, he said, you got two very powerful time statements in the context that says that these were things that were shortly to come to pass, and the time was at hand. And so he just kind of laid that challenge back in Denham's lap in terms of being able to get up and explain whether or not his view could fit within that shortly to come time frame, and the time being near and at hand, but also coupling that together with Luke 21:27 in saying that this generation would by no means pass away till all those things took place. So Holger was just showing the continuity between the Olivet Discourse, which he cited from Matthew 24, from Mark 13, from Luke 21, and he stated that Revelation was simply John's Olivet Discourse, that he was not teaching a different revelation, but it was the same revelation that was given in Luke and those other synoptics, as we mentioned before. And so that was a very, very powerful point. And Denham's only response to that was to continue to repeat what he had said before. He never really addressed the heart of the argument. He just continued to say they saw him, and he was going to be seen, etc. So it was no, as far as memory serves me, there was no real attempt to address what was actually stated on that particular argument. Now, a very interesting argument that was made in the debate was the matter of redemption of the body. And, of course, Holger pointed out that the redemption of the body had to do with the church from Ephesians 1. And we mentioned that a little bit on last week, but Ephesians 1, and he was pointing out the proleptic nature of the redemption. So he and also he did the same thing with the kingdom in stating that the kingdom would come over time that it would grow to a certain point, etc., and that's what was taking place in the time of the New Testament. And Holger pointed out that the gospel wasn't revealed in one day, but it was revealed over time. And these were things that, were common beliefs and common teachings in the church. So those points should have been easily received by the audience. Denham had taken a position that Rome was destroyed in 476 A.D. I believe that's the date that he'd given. And so Holger went back to point out, according to Daniel's prophecy and the growing of the kingdom of God, that you had Babylon destroyed at one point, you had the Medo-Persian kingdom destroyed at another point, you had the Grecian kingdom destroyed at another point. And so he basically asked Denham, how he was going to get all of that crammed into the time of the Seleucids and or any other point apart from the time when the Bible says the kingdom of God would come in its fullness. And so what he did was he pointed out from Luke 21 and verse 28 that this was the time of redemption, and that it was the time of the coming of the kingdom in Luke 21 and verse 31. And he was just simply showing that the kingdom had come to its mature state, to its confirmed state. But again, that was within that generation. So in that same time frame for the first century generation. But also, he pointed out that that was in harmony with verse 27, with Christ coming on the clouds. And so from that perspective, Denham really didn't have, as I said, any arguments that I thought were substantive in terms of refuting those that Holger presented to him. I'm trying to think of another area that they had gone into on some of these things.
I'm very curious. I'm very curious at this point, William. Number one, how much did Holger emphasize the imminence time statements? And number two, did Howard Denham attempt to do what he has done in some of his writings, and that is appeal to several Old Testament prophecies in which he claims that the language of imminence actually extended over centuries? Was that part of it?
I don't recall a lot of emphasis on that. I know Holger referred to the time statements, and he even made sort of a joke when he said to the audience, or just basically he was just teaching, and he said, "We're coming to a congregation near you very soon," or something to that effect. He said, "But don't worry." He said, "But don't worry about it." He said, "In the way that some people understand soon, it'll be 2,000 years."
That's right.
And that was kind of a funny point during the discussion. But I know the comments that you're referring to, because I had some exchanges with him on that very point, where he went back to claim that at hand, did not mean at hand, and or that it extended for long periods of time. I don't think that was a major area of debate, but my memory could be failing me here on that point. I don't think they had a lot of exchange over the time necessarily, even though Holger, made it a point to emphasize that during the debate, where he was making particular points, he would bring up the imminence factor, but it wasn't where you would say that an affirmative argument or something, or affirmative speech, was made solely on the time statement. So that part I do not recall.
Well, I was just curious about that, because the irony, pardon me, the irony of a Church of Christ minister such as Howard Denham, who would get up and seek to negate time statements of imminence. For those listening, folks, those of you who are listening, you have to understand that in countless, I'm talking countless, formal debates between members of the Churches of Christ and dispensationalists, the Church of Christ ministers have emphasized with zeal and with vehemence that when John said, Matthew chapter 3 and verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near, when Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near in Matthew chapter 4, that at hand means at hand, it means near, it means soon, and you cannot make at hand to mean 2,000 years. I know myself, years and years ago, William, I was struggling with the time statements. And as you know, a man in the Churches of Christ who was respected as a great scholar some years ago, he passed away several years ago now, but his name was Guy Woods. And he argued on Matthew chapter 3 and verse 2 in the parallel passages that it is simply false teaching, it is dangerous doctrine to take John's words that said the kingdom of heaven is drawn near and to seek to make that, as the dispensationalists do, turn that into a period of 2,000 years. He said the language, the Greek, simply will not bear that. And I had heard that comment made over and over and over in public speeches. I had heard it in public formal debates. I had read it in written debates. Well, then, as I'm struggling with the time statements and realize that they are legitimate, they're real, they're objective, I begin to wonder, well, okay, since Guy Woods was so vehement and powerful in his comments on the meaning of engaken, the perfect tense of ingus, in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 2, then how would he deal with James chapter 5 verse 8, where James said, the parousia, the coming of the Lord, has drawn near, the identical Greek word in the identical Greek tense. So I grabbed the Bible Advocate commentary written by Guy Woods, and I was stunned. I remember it to this very day. Guy Woods said that this passage, and obviously this is a paraphrase, but he said something to the effect that this passage has caused consternation by a lot of people, caused a lot of people to take a skeptical view. But he said it was not James's purpose to say that the coming of the Lord was actually near, because if that were true, then he was wrong. All that James really intended to say was that the coming of the Lord is so certain to occur as to mean that it could be near. And like I said, I was absolutely stunned at how disingenuous, how self-contradictory Guy Woods' own argument really was. In regard to the kingdom, the perfect tense of ingus has to mean at hand, quickly, soon, shortly, and near. It cannot mean 2,000 years. But the identical Greek word in the identical Greek tense, when talking about the coming of the Lord in James chapter 5, has no bearing, no meaning, no significance of imminence at all. And so it is strange to me, and I remember the exchange that you had with Howard Denham in regard to the time statements. I was involved in that somewhat myself. And it's just stunning when you have a man who would call dispensationalism infidelity and false doctrine if the premillennialists got up and said, well, you know, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years as a day. So just because Jesus and John both said the kingdom of heaven is drawn near, that could be 2,000 years. I mean, after all, it's only been 2 days in God's time. And I can guarantee you that if Howard Denham were debating a dispensationalist, he would call that rank heresy. But when debating a full preterist, what does he do? Oh, he runs off to the Old Testament in a desperate attempt to find some passage, any passage, in which, by completely and totally ignoring the context of the statement, he could argue, oh, look, this took place over a period of hundreds of years, therefore, at hand doesn't mean that. I mean, how disingenuous can you get? That just shows the utter desperation of the opponents of covenant eschatology. On the one hand, pun intended, at hand must mean near. On the other hand, if you're debating a premillennialist, it's at hand. It means quickly and shortly. But when you're debating a preterist, at hand doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything whatsoever. And like I said, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead and finish your statement, and I'll come in.
Well, I'm just simply going to conclude by saying this is simply embarrassing from a linguistic perspective, from an argument perspective, and from a logic perspective, for a man to stand up and argue both of those positions.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is. Now, one of the points that Denham made in response to the at-hand time statements was that Holger was applying, and that he charged, all of the preterists, if you please, who make the argument on the time statements, that what is being done is that we are applying time to beings without a time continuum. In other words, time only refers to people in this life. So when you die, or in the realm after death, time has no bearing. There is no such thing as time. And that was his attempt. That was his, I think he really considered that a strong argument.
And my question would be, how in the name of logic does that help him, since the entire Bible was written by man, descending, as it were, into man's world, speaking to man about events to take place in man's world. Therefore, by his own definition of at hand and the application of time words, they have to be given their objective meaning, because they have no objective meaning in God's realm. I mean, how ridiculous of an argument is that anyway?
Yeah, exactly. So, but that was what he thought was a very significant argument to the point of the time statements. And as you say, I mean, of course, he's going to negate every time statement that you have in Scripture. I mean, just think about it. If Daniel was to rise at the end of the days, there's time involved in that. I don't see how in the world he could even argue that, even for his own view from that perspective. But that was one of the arguments that he made.
Well, it raises the question then: if time means simply nothing to God, then why did Jesus say, "But of that day and hour knows no man, but the Father only"? Isn't that speaking of God in the eternal realm? Because after all, the Father is not here on earth in man's world, right? And yet God, who transcends time, who transcends the human realm, Jesus himself said the Father knew the day and the hour. Not only that, Paul said God, that is the Father, had appointed a day in which he was about to judge the world in righteousness. So here is God, who doesn't know anything whatsoever about time, nonetheless appointed a day. Well, how did he do that if he wasn't thinking and communicating about events in man's world to be understood by man in the way that man understands time words? Again, that kind of an argument, and of course I've heard that before many, many times, but that kind of an argument just makes you shake your head at the utter illogic, the utter lack of thought that goes into making arguments like that. But look, as I was sharing with Steve Baisden today, and I was sharing with him some of the things that I've been hearing and reading from some of our brethren in the churches of Christ, I said, with all due kindness and respect, it seems to me that an awful lot of our brethren are not thinking past their nose when they make some of these arguments. And as you and I have pointed out many, many times, both in this on this program and in personal conversations, and we've even said it in public debate, we think that our brethren get so desperate, they get so trapped by their own doctrine, pardon me, that they just make up arguments out of completely thin air, arguments that they have no more given thought to than the man in the moon, arguments that they would no more make in a debate with, again, a dispensationalist or anyone else for that matter. And yet, because they are so desperate, they just throw something out there, hoping that something will stick. As I said, I invented that Latin term a long time ago to describe and to define what the opponents of covenant eschatology do. When they make up these really desperate arguments, and that Latin term is argumentum ad desperatum. No, folks, that's not a real Latin term. But it's Don Preston's Latin term to define the utter silliness of some of the arguments that the opponents of covenant eschatology wind up making. It's just amazing.
Yes, it most definitely is. Now, one of the areas of argumentation was from, one, before we get to that one, was on the end of the world. Of course, Denham argues that the world will end based on the law of thermodynamics, and so he claims that everything, was winding down, and of course, Holger points out that, we have a world without end, that it was a kingdom that is without end, and then they discuss the resurrection, where Holger points out from Hosea chapter 6, and I know you're very familiar with that the only place in the Old Testament where it was mentioned in the scriptures that Christ would rise from the dead on the third day, or that the resurrection would occur in connection with the quote from 1 Corinthians 15 was Hosea 6. Well, Denham initially tried to deny that connection, tried to act as though it wasn't there. But Holger continued to emphasize that, and that was one of the strong points on that particular point that he made from Hosea chapter 6, and demonstrating both the nature of the death there, but also the source for Paul's resurrection teaching. And he did a good job in demonstrating that, contrary to what Denham said, which was that the Corinthians were denying the resurrection of the dead, Holger pointed out that no, they weren't denying the resurrection of the dead, meaning all the dead, that they were denying the resurrection of a class or a group or some of the dead. And he pointed out that the various distinctions between Paul's arguments that are made in the chapter on the resurrection, that those whose resurrection was being denied was Israel's resurrection, was being denied primarily by the Gentiles, is what Holger had argued, and he laid out the various arguments which Denham never really referred to. Now, I'm trying to think of one argument Denham made on 1 Corinthians 15 that I actually agreed with, and I did point that out to Holger. It didn't change the course of the discussion very much. It was just a point that I thought Denham was correct on, and I'm trying to remember it even as we speak. But I can't remember that particular point. But the overall argumentation was that 1 Corinthians 15, was not the resurrection of dead bodies coming out of the ground. It was the resurrection of the dead. It had to do with spiritual death, and that it was some whose resurrection was being denied and not all. And Holger, laid that out very well. And that's a point that I don't think Denham ever really grasped the significance of in terms of what Holger was pointing out in that particular point. And, of course, I know you know the arguments very well. You've been teaching on 1 Corinthians 15 now for at least a couple of months or so. So if you want to, just touch on a couple of those arguments from 1 Corinthians 15 relative to that point, I think it might be helpful.
Yes, well, I don't have to tell you, and as you pointed out, Denham was obviously making the very common argument that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 was dealing with a conflict in which there was some element of the church that was denying the reality of physical resurrection or resurrection, period. I know that's the view that I was raised believing. That's the view that is still taught. I'll never forget, however, being at Abilene some years ago. I don't remember if you were with me or not, but I know that Jack Scott was there, and we listened to Randy Cope in the keynote presentation one night in the great big auditorium meeting, and he went through 1 Corinthians 15, the first 19 verses, and I know Jack and I turned to each other and we said, this guy knows more than he's letting on. Because he even pointed out in that speech that Paul's adversaries at Corinth were not denying resurrection. They were denying resurrection to a certain group of people. And that's when Jack and I turned to each other and go, uh-oh, this guy knows something. This guy's in trouble. And he obviously he never developed that. That would have been an atomic bomb going off in that auditorium. But the point of the fact is, Paul is dealing with a group of people that were denying, as you've already suggested, and as Holger pointed out, a group of people that were denying resurrection life to a given class of people. And the easiest way to show that he's not dealing with adversaries who are denying resurrection, he says, if Christ is not risen, and if the dead ones are not raised, then also, that key word also, those who have fallen asleep have perished. Now, here is Paul using the form of argumentation known as modus potens, and it means if this is true, then this must be true. So Paul's argumentation was, if you were going to say that there is no resurrection of the dead ones, then you have to say there is no resurrection for Christians who have died, and yet the force of Paul's argument is they do not believe that Christians who have died have perished. They believe that Christians would receive resurrection life, and since they believe that Christians who had died would be resurrected to life, they could not be denying resurrection. And if they denied resurrection as a whole, as a simple subject, then when Paul said, if the dead are not raised, then Christ is not raised. Well, the force of the argument, once again, the modus potens argument is, look, you scoffers are saying the dead ones are not raised. But if you're going to say the dead ones are not raised, that means that Jesus is not raised. And the force of Paul's argument is for them to say, no, Paul, we accept the resurrection of Jesus. So Paul's argument, therefore, is if you accept the resurrection of Jesus, guess what? You have to admit that the dead ones, who died before Jesus, by the way, the force of the Greek text, they too are resurrected. You cannot say that those scoffers at Corinth were denying resurrection, because they did not deny the resurrection of Jesus. They did not deny the resurrection of dead Christians. Therefore, they were not denying resurrection. They just denied it for those who had died before Jesus, of whom Paul said Christ had become the firstfruits of those who had fallen asleep. That is, they had died before Jesus. Jesus was the first fruit of that group of people. It doesn't say, by the way, that Jesus was the first fruit of the Christians who had died. He is focused like a laser on those who had died before Jesus died, and of whom Christ was the first to be raised. He's very emphatic about that. And there's so much more that can be said on that. Folks, look, if you haven't been tuning in to my YouTube videos on 1 Corinthians 15, as William pointed out, I've been doing a thematic study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I believe I've produced 96 or 97 videos now. They are on YouTube. And just go to YouTube and type in the search bar, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, Don K. Preston, and you will find those videos there. And I have to tell you, William, I have had so many incredible responses to that series of lessons. I've obviously had some objections. I've had people calling me Gnostics, as Howard Denham did call, Holger. It's amazing to me that people don't even know what a Gnostic is. That's a real problem. They throw that term around as if they do know what it is, when in reality, they obviously do not know what Gnosticism was. So anyway, that's a little bit of a sidebar. But anyway, folks, be sure to check out my videos on the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I believe that you will find a lot of information there that will be helpful to you. I know literally hundreds of people have told me that this series on this thematic study of the resurrection has been of absolute tremendous assistance to them. And by the way, in the upcoming weeks and months and videos, I'm going to be developing the resurrection as the fulfillment, number one, of Israel's Old Covenant hopes, and number two, as the fulfillment of certain given Old Testament prophecies. And that will be, pardon me, that will be, I hope, extremely informative for those who believe that they have a handle on resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 and insist that Paul is focused primarily upon the raising of individual bodies out of the grave. Paul is not focused on that at all. And our study of the fulfillment of those Old Testament prophecies that serve as the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine in 1 Corinthians 15 will drive that point home irrefutably. To me, it's the clearest thing that there could be. So go to YouTube, search for the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 by Don K. Preston, and be watching for the continuing series on the resurrection. It's a thematic study. We've been doing linguistic studies. We've been doing, up to this point, some textual studies and what have you. But again, I think you'll find that helpful. By the way, to kind of close this program down for this evening, and we really appreciate William's sharing with us his impression of the Denham-Neubauer debate. I want to remind everyone that on May the 10th, which is 8 days from today, I will be having a formal YouTube debate, and if possible, it will be carried live right here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio as well. It will be live streamed on YouTube. It will be live streamed on Facebook. As soon as William can get all the technical side of it, lined out, so that we have a link that we can post for you, we will be posting that on our websites. We'll be posting it on YouTube. We'll be posting it on Facebook so that you can tune in. I can tell you that there's already a lot of interest in this debate. Jaime Pickett will be my opponent. He is a progressive dispensationalist. He is not your typical dispensational premillennialist, although I must say that in his writings that he has been posting on Facebook, there's barely a hair's breadth of difference between his view and that of traditional dispensationalism. But the focus of our discussion will be the salvation of Israel in Romans 11, 25 to 27. You don't want to miss this, so be sure to tune in May the 10th for the debate between Jaime Pickett and Don K. Preston. And with that, it appears that we're out of time. I want to thank you again so much for joining us for Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with that, I will say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.